Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Noel Kent. We're celebrating the anniversary of his book, Hawaii Islands Under the Influence. Yep. And he really is one of those inspiring professors that uses his tenure and voice, yes, to really raise the consciousness of those around him. So we're honored to have him with us tonight, Noel.
This program's having all kinds of spin-offs because I brought Joe Burns into my classes today, and he was talking about his work with labor unions, and it's interesting and also sad to see that a lot of young people, in their early 20s, our students at UH, really don't know much. They have very negative feelings and feel that labor unions are something of the past, and that's something that we really have to change. We really have to educate people about the fact that this is the opportune time for labor to really begin to flex its muscles once again and to grow and to become a dynamic factor in American and Hawaiian society. It's Friday. We've all had long weeks. Usually when I come to Mark's Garage, it's for a little comedy. So I thought I would provide some breaking news in a nutshell. And that's my application to become the next president of the University of Hawaii. This is directed Chair Martinson. The word, I'm just going to read the highlights here. The word on the street is that you are still looking for a long-term university president. On that score, I qualify. The university having been quite close to my heart for some 45 years now. I'm also a very imperfect human being, which makes me a very good match for a very imperfect board of regents. 9 reasons why you should, a number of reasons you should hire me. I am not Marcy Greenwood, nor Evan DeBell. I am cheap. You have been roundly criticized for paying huge salaries to UH executives. But I will do the job for my current salary, which is a mere 20% of what you now pay Greenwood. And you don't need to give me a fat $60,000 a year housing stipend either. I pledge not to embarrass you. If I can't support some of the absurd decisions you regents make, I'll maintain a dignified silence. I will support continuing to pour millions of dollars into a UH Manoa athletic program. Since sports are a real priority, our underfunded academic side must continue to subsidize the deficits athletics run. On my watch, football coaches who do no work will continue to get 6-digit salaries. We know in our heart of hearts that UH autonomy has been a disaster, an excuse for the boys downtown to cut funding for the university to shreds. But let me assure you, I would never demand that the people of Hawaii take responsibility for educating our students. So rest assured, the sacred formula, higher UH tuition each year in return for fewer course offerings and diminished services, will receive my undying support. Governor Neil Abercrombie, whom I have known and distrusted since the 1970s, may bully other people, but he can't bully me. I promise to bring home the bacon and the malasadas. I will maintain the current policy of throwing up expensive new campus buildings. Contracts, of course, going to politically connected firms, even as our older buildings are allowed to crumble into dust. So all in all, regents, you could not hope to find a better candidate for presidency than yours truly. My only request is that you keep the large, extremely well-paid public relations outfit in Bachman Hall at my disposal. After all, if and when UH faculty and students figure out my loyalties are to you, and to my own career, I am going to need those folks to launch the same whitewash campaign they did for MRC. Of course, scapegoats will have to be located to take the heat off. In sum, I eagerly await your letter of appointment and look forward to serving your interests in the year to come. Aloha e nimua, Professor Noel J. Kent, the next UH honcho. I'm as good as in.
Noel Kent for president.
So we have this book which came out 30 years ago, which is a little bit unbelievable to me. So as I was looking at it for the first time in quite a while this week, I was thinking, you know, when you were in your 30s and you wrote this, you weren't a complete lolo. You had some good ideas, even some good writing, but I also was embarrassed at reading it because, of course, after 30 years, you become a very different human being, as I'm sure you are from what you wrote, Roxanne. So I was embarrassed at how inflexible I was, the arrogant tone of certainty in the book. I mean, I get very suspicious these days of anybody who's too certain about anything. I was trying to apply an all-embracing sort of master theory to a very complex picture. Age brings humility, as many of us know. Pushing 70 these days, I now ask myself, how, after living so long, do I manage to know so damn little? Okay, right. So the origin of all this is back in around 1970 when I was returning to Hawaii. And it was obvious that Hawaii was undergoing some major changes. And there was all this glorification, the celebration of Hawaii, the whole how the oligarchy had disappeared. We now had a stable, prosperous, multi-ethnic democracy in which people who had grown up on plantations were now moving into middle-class lives. And some of us were looking around, and I'm putting Ray Catania over there myself, and we were a little bit doubtful about all of this. We saw a lot of poor people, we saw a housing crisis, traffic jams, high-rises, they called it the kind Hawaiian bird. Remember that? The kind Hawaiian bird, the cranes that were everywhere. A lot of environmental degradation, Kaneohe Bay and other places. Tourism had grown by 5 times in one decade between 1960 and 1970. Urban sprawl was moving right across central Oahu. Hawaiian culture was treated as a commodity. Native Hawaiians felt alien in their own place. We seem to be losing the sense of who we were as a unique island place. But you couldn't tell the truth. People didn't want to hear this truth. And the person who tried to tell the truth the most was a guy named Tom Gill, who was congressman for Hawaii for a while. And he was a remarkable man. And he really put it out there. He really started talking about what was really happening to us as a society, as a people, as a community. And in his 1970 campaign for governor, he came very close to winning, which would have been a real watershed in Hawaii history. I think Gill was really determined and a very strong person to try and begin to stop the sort of onrush of development that was overwhelming the islands. And he was beaten by John Burns, who had put together this coalition of land developers and others who financed his campaign about 4 to 5 times that of what Gill had in terms of his resources. And Gill was beaten. But I think that was a watershed campaign in Hawaii's political history. And throughout the 70s, together with people like Ray and others, we tried to resist that growth machine in Kalama Valley, Waihoʻoli Waikani. Sometimes we won, sometimes we lost. But I also had the notion that as a historian, I could begin to tell some truths also, which might motivate people to act. So I started writing some articles, eventually got into the UH Political Science Department, and under the guidance of Bob Stauffer and other fine scholars, I wrote this book, Islands Under Influence. And although UH would not touch it initially, which is interesting, Professor Mimi Sharma did mention it to Judy Rubin at Monthly Review in New York, and they published it, and the rest is sort of history. This was not a really original work in the sense that I didn't have an original theoretical model. I used the dependencia model, which was popular in studying Latin American development, using Hawaii as a case study. The basic argument, since the Hawaiians discovered James Cook at Kealakekua Bay back in 1778, The political, economic, and social development of Hawaii was largely shaped by global forces and global power, provisioning, sandalwood, whaling, plantation, agriculture. And in the process, the Native Hawaiian people lose first their land and ultimately their sovereignty, which is delivered into the hands of the United States government and also the Haole Plantation financial elite here in Honolulu. The second part of the book deals with what we call the New Hawaii. This is the era of unchallenged American dominance in the Pacific American Lake, and Hawaii promises to be made a centerpiece in the developing Pacific drama. So we see these immense transformations taking place throughout the 1950s and 60s. The Big Five abandoning sugar and pineapple, allying with overseas corporations to build lavish hotels in various places, all kinds of partnerships, local key Asian developers, Herbert Horita, people like this, financiers, moving into large-scale suburban development. The profound transition of the state bureaucracy itself into a major support for the new growth model. Huge funds spent on infrastructure like the H1 and airports and everything else that had to be done to turn Hawaii into a tourism place. Developing large, huge projects on Maui, Kauai, the Big Island. And I mean, so what we have is a fusing of political and economic power in Hawaii in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And there was always denial about where this was all leading because people understood that tourism was a very fragile and volatile industry. They understood that making Hawaii into a tourism place was very dangerous. So Burns and the people around him always denied that Hawaii was ultimately headed toward becoming this tourism mecca. They talked about Hawaii as a dynamic Pacific core, a place that regional corporations would locate headquarters. The building of the University of Hawaii Manoa as a major institution was part of this whole process. The building of a TIM school, the fact that in 1961, 62, and 63, 25 major departments were added to the university. There was a huge investment of money in an attempt to create this University of the Pacific concept. I might add that a lot of bad stuff was done. You know, we're talking about chemical warfare in Syria. The UH campus saw anthrax tested, it saw polytoxins tested. Indonesian police in the 60s were trained for what ultimately became the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Indonesians later. So, I mean, there was some really bad stuff done in this idea of Hawaii as a major Pacific hub. So, what happens in the 50s and 60s is that basically we have a reform group of Democratic politicians turned into part of the establishment, perhaps part of the oligarchy in some cases. We also see some of the downside of tourism beginning to emerge. The leakage of tourist monies out of the economy, low-paying jobs, overseas-owned hotels, and overseas-owned the anti-commanding sectors of the economy. Tourism profits come from government subsidies and basically low wages. It's an ethnic division of labor within the hotels and the whole industry. So by the time I'm writing this book, it's obvious to me that we're in a sort of age of complete dependency, that U.S. and also Japanese corporations have come to dominate the commanding heights of the Hawaii economy, and this creates a lot of vulnerability. Okay, so 30 years later, how does this stand up? The book has lots of flaws. The study has lots of flaws. I think it's over-mechanistic, and it doesn't really deal with some of the complexities. It completely misses the arrival of a Native Hawaiian sovereignty movement, which I might have seen coming and I didn't. I also miss the revival of the Chinese economy and the fact that the Chinese will become major players at some point, probably in Hawaii's economy. But the book, I think, in essence, captures what really did happen, what kind of world we have to live with in Hawaii in a certain sense. You can read the latest reports, economic reports about Hawaii, which are here, and you can find out that our unemployment is down to the lowest level since 2007. Construction's up, bankruptcies are down, tourism occupancy in Waikiki and the rest of the state is almost 80%. The revenues flowing into the state coffers are higher than they've been in years. So it really sounds rosy. It sounds good. But this still is, it remains a dependent society, dependent on tourism and construction and military spending. 1/5 of state tax revenue, 17.5% of employment is around tourism. About 23% of the economy is around the military. We've had 20 years of basically slow growth in Hawaii, which have really devastated government finances, which have created all sorts of problems in delivering public services. I don't know if you remember, but when 9/11 took place, tourism virtually collapsed here. You could have fired a cannonball down Kalakaua Avenue, and nobody would have gotten hurt because nobody was there. The Japanese didn't want to come out of respect to the Americans. The Americans didn't want to come because they didn't want to get on airplanes. And who could blame anybody? Which really, in a sense, demonstrates the ultimate fragility of locating a tourism plant 2,500 miles away from any major population area. 2008-9, when the economy was in shambles, people didn't come either, and you had a real downturn, and hundreds of tourism workers were laid off. So what you have is a very fragile, vulnerable economy, which is really dependent on industries which are in trouble. The Department of Planning and Economic Development for the state says Hawaii's economy depends significantly on conditions in the U.S. economy and key international economies, especially Japan, which might be the understatement of the year. The labor force in Hawaii is concentrated in lower service industries, which is a problem in a high-cost, low-wage economy. There's an ethnic hierarchy in place. The largest number of jobs in our economy are in retail sales, servers, office clerks, cashiers, janitors, cleaners, housekeeping, food prep, fast food workers, all of which are low-income jobs. This creates a wide gap between living expenses and wages. Families' basic living expenses aren't being made. A decent two-bedroom rental is out of the reach of the majority of working people in Hawaii. In the last 2 years, if we look at the top five occupations which have increased jobs, that's retail sales, food prep, office clerks, waiters and waitresses. I know that my students do service learning and do a lot of community service, and one of the major places we're at is the Next Step Homeless Shelter. And what really shocks and amazes the students is to see the families that are in the shelters getting up in the morning. The mom and dad go to work, and the kids go to school. So these aren't the mentally ill, these aren't bums, these aren't people who really are lazy, too lazy to work. These are just ordinary working people who simply can't get the down payment or can't get the resources to get out of homelessness. This really shocks them because it really upsets the whole stereotype that they've had of this thing. The military spending angle is also a problem because, of course, there was the Inouye factor, which brought in about $1 billion a year and probably distorted our economy in ways that weren't very, very healthy. Of course, it's impossible to say anything bad about Dan Inouye in Hawaii, and sometimes I think that he's sort of like a Saint Joan of Arc here. I mean, it's the laudatory praise that one talks about him, and in spite of other things. Anyway, so what we see in Hawaii at this point is a crisis of affordable housing, a crisis of healthcare, a crisis of quality education, also a political crisis of a politics which is degraded by money. People in Hawaii feel excluded from managing our public affairs. They feel the system is dysfunctional. We have a system dominated by political pygmies like Joe Suki, Calvin Say, Neil Abercrombie, Kimberly Pine, and others. We have a governor who proposes a public land development corporation which will turn public lands over to private interests under the nomenclature of private-public partnerships, which will redistribute public wealth to companies. The city council this week allowed the co-orange development to go through, which will basically erase 565 prime agricultural acres, which we could be growing food for our own self-sufficiency. So no wonder young people, as they look at the system, they have a lot of distaste for politics, and they have a lot of disrespect for public goods, and that they fall away from public engagement. What we need is a language which expresses our moral instincts and need for shared social obligation. What we need is to convert the interests we have into collective goals. We liberals, social democrats, radicals, etc., need to find a new language to inspire others to get involved in the way that we govern ourselves. The existing political class will not do radical political renewal. Only we can. Those who govern us, we must learn how to criticize those who govern us. We need to become angrier at our present condition. I take beta blockers and for controlling my blood pressure, so maybe that's good. We do not all want the same things. Rich people and poor people do not want the same things. Some people need public services, and some people need jobs. Some people need peace, and other people need war. Some people need salaries, and other people need dividends. We don't all need the same things, and we should get used to the fact that there are real conflicting interests in this society that we have to deal with. We have to talk about fairness, equity, hope, stewardship of the Aina. We need to recast our public conversation. We need a new language of politics. We actually open a different conversation based on our instincts. What must the state do for men and women to allow them to pursue decent lives? Globalization favors the most oppressive and low-wage economies. It creates mass unemployment and underemployment. The left, as we know it in America and in Hawaii, has failed to respond to the crisis of 2008 and shifted away from the state toward the market, which I think is a tragic mistake. We've been on the defensive for a generation. It is really time for us, and including the labor union movement, to take the offensive once again. As free citizens, we have a duty to both analyze our society and act if we think things are wrong. There is definitely a role for unions in Hawaii to begin to make the kind of changes that they did in the 1930s and 40s. They can lead their workers and others in these communities in discussions, in mobilizations, to advocate change and support for the excluded, to become a social movement. When labor unions have been most effective in the United States, when they have been social movements tied to the needs of vast numbers of people, some of whom are in the unions and some of whom are out of them. Labor unions can play a vital role in providing leadership to combat economic security and forge new policies. And we need to really develop a totally different alternative vision of the sort of world that we're being led into now. My late Manoa colleague, Ira Roeder, imagined a Hawaii of co-housing, town planning, citizen projects, neighborhood co-ops, reduced reliance on tourism, self-sufficiency in agriculture and energy, replacing reliance on imported goods, a cultural tourism, which was not alienating, a citizen-based politics, ecologically designed habitats, resource conservation, a shoreline with a diversified local economy, energy-efficient buildings. We can do that. That's a vision that we can pursue. We need to hold out an alternative vision that people can believe in. We need boldness, creativity, courage, and a set of strategies that will inspire the people of Hawaii. Imua.
Yeah. Feel good about stacking.